Hi, Misha here. It's the beginning of March, which means it's time for the next issue in Eaglemoss's diecast line of models from the Battlestar Galactica universe. They have been doing models from the original series, the reimagined series, and a couple of issues ago, they did the first model from the unfortunately short-lived series Blood and Chrome. They did the Cylon Raider, which seemed a bit of an odd choice because it was the first model from Blood and Chrome, and they did this before even finishing out the models for the reimagined series. Of course, the very first model we got in the collection here is the Viper Mark II. This was the premier starfighter of the Colonial fleet at the beginning of the Cylon War, the first one, and continued to serve all the way through it. And in some ways it was an upgrade, and in some ways it was kind of a scaling back of the original Mark I. The Mark I being the Viper from the original series, which was inserted into the reimagined series as kind of the predecessor, pre-war model. And for Blood and Chrome, we got this here, the Mark III. This is the most recent issue in the line. This is issue, I think we're up to 16 or 15. I guess this is maybe 15. Yeah, I think 16 is Scar. But yeah, we're progressing along quite nicely now in the series. And this is an interesting model. It really bridges the gap. The Blood and Chrome Raider attempted to bridge the gap between the TOS Raider and the reimagined Raider, and I think they did a great job. The model itself, as I've said in other videos, is a little on the light side, but it is highly detailed, more so than the original series. Well, with the Mark III Viper, they attempted to bridge the gap between the Mark II and the later Mark VII, which was the premier Viper by the time of the Second Cylon War, or the fall of the colonies, which have you. What about Marks 4, 5, and 6? Well, who knows. But up until Blood and Chrome, a couple of years ago, there wasn't even a Mark III, so they left themselves some room. And to be fair, since there are 40 years difference between the end of the first war and the beginning of the second, plenty of time for new marks. And as usual, since apparently I have to do this caveat and waiver each video, it gets repetitive for me too, guys. I am blind, doing the best I can. Sorry if you don't like it. Do your own. Anyway. Not a lot of in-universe info on the Mark III. Again, because Blood and Chrome was pretty much canceled with only the pilot. But we know about 10 years in to the first Cylon War, these started to be phased into service to supplement and then maybe replace the Mark II. It's a similar ship, but whereas the Mark II was pretty much a space superiority fighter meant for space dogfighting, with the Mark III, they wanted to have a craft better suited for atmospheric fighting and also more of a multi-role craft capable of performing other duties like a fighter bomber, reconnaissance. They were hoping for a longer range, better endurance. To that end, even though we have the same 230mm cannon as the Mark II, and we have the same 3-engine setup as we see on most Vipers, we have a slightly more aerodynamic design. We have a more rounded cockpit and more rounded edges versus sharp edges. Also, we have 2 internal weapons bays on the underside of the fuselage, meaning that they can be retracted with doors to reduce drag. It's also possible they could mount more Javelin missiles under the wings externally. So kind of like the current F-35 Lightning II. This was also a larger aircraft or spacecraft than the Mark II. We don't really have a firm size. We know that it was bigger than the Mark II, but the only size statement puts it at about 10.5 meters long, about 6 3/4 meters wide, and a little under 4 meters tall. The problem with that's too large for the Viper launch tubes. So either those specs are too big, or Battlestars would actually have to have refitted tubes to use the Mark III. Now, one kind of continuity error, or however you'd like to view it, in Blood and Chrome, the hangar deck, the launch bay, this is called the hot stack of Mark IIIs. Everything looks bigger. So, yeah, I really don't think, since the Mark VII uses the same tubes as the Mark II, that this would technically be that big. But it is very clear, even from this model, that it's a bulkier design. Like, the nose is wider than the Mark II. Mark II is a little more slender. Intakes and whatnot. It's got a big scoop on the front, which is very reminiscent of the Mark VII. The wings are quite large. Anyway, the larger size would give it more ability to carry additional mission equipment, additional ordnance, or just more fuel or advanced navigation systems, giving it more of a multi-role ability. So not unlike kind of a combination of a Raptor and a Viper. But yeah, they were phasing these in around year 10 of the first Cylon War, and it doesn't seem like they were ever completely phased in before the end of the war at year 12. So these are just coming into widespread use after development at the end of the war. It would have been continued on in Colonial fleet use for some time after the war. And that's about all we know, unfortunately. Now, real world, this design, the Mark III, is actually a tribute to an early design that would be evolved originally into the Mark II back in 2003 for the miniseries. The reason they kind of downgraded the detail level from that design to the Mark II was for a full-scale mock-up and to handle the CGI abilities of the day. It's also said that the Mark III kind of pays homage to the never-produced Battlestar Galactica reboot, which was tried before the one we actually received. Either way, this design actually dates back to the very early 21st century and was realized finally with Blood and Chrome. And as you can tell with the model, it does have a lot more detail than the Mark II. It's got more sticky out bits, like on the edges of the wings. Somewhere somewhere. There we are. Kind of got a little spike at the edge. A little bit of, like a little rear antenna there. Also on the underside of the nose, there's a little more detailing. Sorry, it's really hard for me to pick this up because it is quite a heavy model. But yeah, you can tell this is a later use, more modern computer equipment to generate it, and just meant to be a more fancy, more gadgety variant compared to the Mark II, leaving the Mark VII kind of the modern, sleek variant. So yeah, makes kind of sense. You know, the Mark II can be seen as like a World War II or Korean War aircraft, especially with the squared canopy and whatnot. Not ugly, has its own elegance, but it is more straight-edged and boxy. Whereas the Mark VII is a kind of more of a modern fighter, like a F-16 or even an F-22 or F-35, very rounded and smooth. Meaning the Mark III kind of fits in the middle, kind of like a Vietnam Air aircraft. Like really reminds me of the F-4 Phantom, because it is big and lots of antenna sticking out. You know, the Phantom was basically a flying brick. It got into the sky through brute force, and that's kind of what the Mark III looks like, a very large but very powerful craft. Lots of antenna for sensors sticking out, but still clearly more advanced than the two. And this really completes our Vipers. We have the 1, the 2, the 3, the 7. We even had the Blackbird that I did a video on. So we pretty much have all the Viper-shaped craft now in the collection. As far as Raiders, we have this one, we have the original, we have the reimagined, we have Scar coming out, which is a variant of the reimagined Raider. I hope we do get a heavy Raider, just to kind of complete the Raider setup. But yeah, we're really closing in. There's a couple more Battlestars we could get, like the Valkyrie. I'd like to see the Valkyrie. And after that, we'll pretty much be into things like the Resurrection ship or the Resurrection hub, or any number of the civilian ships from the fleet, like the Tillingham tanker or whatnot. We still have things we can do. But yeah, they promised us at least 12 issues in the collection, and now we're up to 16, so obviously sales are pretty decent if they're extending it out. The model here is kind of what we've come to expect from the Eaglemoss Battlestar Galactica. It's quite massive, nearly a foot long, and this thing is heavy. The entire top part of the fuselage is metal. Of course, the wings and the rear nozzle of the engines are plastic. The cockpit, of course, is clear plastic. And part of the underside is plastic. Some of it's metal, some of it's plastic. The guns are, of course, plastic. It sounds like a lot of plastic, but it's really not when you consider the largest chunk is pretty much solid die-cast metal. Meaning that this, yeah, has some real weight to it. Probably, yeah, I'd say slightly heavier than the Mark II. The Mark II is a very heavy craft. It's nearly all metal itself. But this, because it's just a slightly fatter design, does weigh more. Which is good, because while I like the Blood and Chrome Raider, it's probably our lightest in the family. so far, just because of how thin it is. Still really like it. It's a cool design, but it is a little on the skimpy side. So it's nice that its Colonial companion here is nice and beefy. But yeah, as usual, I'll do more of a fleet layout with this, discussing it, comparing it more. But I always like to give a first look. And I hope I did get something on camera for you fine folks. This is a neat collection, so I encourage you to check it out. And if you use some coupon codes and take advantage of the reduced or free shipping, the price is not too shabby, really. Well, with that said, I appreciate you tuning in. If you could, like, share, and subscribe. Otherwise, this is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.